Greetings, this is Griff Ruby, the Nostalgia Catholic, with yet another Isaac Asimov short story. Well, this one was first published in this hardbound volume titled New Dimensions 2, 11 Original Science Fiction Stories, edited by Robert Silverberg. Not sure I get that cover, but that's okay. It has a quick list of all the stories in here, and the one that's most relevant is Take a Match by Isaac Asimov. And the only difference on the table of contents is a page number, which here is 160. So, what do we have on page 116? We have a small blurb, and it reads this. There's no artwork. Does Isaac Asimov need introduction to this book's readers? Must novels like Caves of Steel, Currents of Space, and the Foundation trilogy be mentioned? Must we cite his 50-foot shelf of nonfiction, running the gamut from the intelligent man's guide to science to the sensuous, dirty old man? No, not a further word about him, except to say that Asimov is writing science fiction again after too long a lapse, and it's good to have him back. So the reason is he still wasn't writing very much. Even many of the pieces that were coming out were older things that, for whatever reason, were kind of lost by the wayside. And somebody would say, "Can you give me something?" And he'd find something rather than write something. But finally, he decides to write one, and it's a pretty straightforward story. We have this is set in the time when you travel faster than light through using the jump, which occurs in the Foundation series, the Galactic Era novels, and many other stories. And you even get some glimpses of the start of that era in one scenario in the iRobot stories, and in a somewhat different scenario in the Nemesis scenario. So you have these different scenarios. But the bottom line is, it starts kind of crude and bumpy and jerky and scary, but after a while, with hundreds or thousands of years of honing it and perfecting it, it gets as reliable and trustworthy as taking something on a truck from here to there. We don't question it, or a railroad car from this place to that place. We don't, despite the slight possibilities of accidents or derailments, we don't really have to worry about any of that stuff at all. That said, this is set, though, when there's still one other problem, is that you could land in the middle of a dust cloud, and the dust cloud could consist of some, well, ideally, if it's just hydrogen out there, or even a mixture of hydrogen and helium, it's okay. You can, because apparently what their ships do is they would gather this tiny stuff, even a handful of atoms per cubic, however large area, because outer space is a virtual vacuum. But it might be there's still the occasional free atoms floating here and there. So you would in effect be scooping this stuff up, compressing it down, and having, let's say, hydrogen to use for thermonuclear fusion to power your craft. So it's kind of a puzzle box story in a way, because the way in this cloud is so opaque you can't even see any stars. So you don't know where you are. Now, one other thing is, you're not allowed quite enough energy to do more than one jump at a time. You're supposed to stop, take a few days, look around, and oh, by the way, use the scoop to get the hydrogen atoms floating in empty space, or virtually empty space, until you get enough of this stuff to have a nice fusion blast to give you the power to do another jump. I noticed that when we get to the era of Foundation's Edge and beyond, they've somehow conquered all of that, and you can just do multiple jumps almost right, bam, 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 bam. But that's way, way, way in the future. So, when we're looking at much more primitive times in the development of the jump, you do a jump, and you're not allowed to save enough energy for another jump. You have to be just a little bit short. Not a lot, but you have to be short so that you can't do two jumps without stopping to take some time. They set this as a requirement or something in the interest of some kind of safety, because the jumps weren't very well controllable, and you kind of needed to use that time to gain your bearings again and make sure you really know where you are and proceed correctly. Because if you just assume where you are, it could be way off. They're still kind of imprecise. That's the premise of the whole thing. Now they've landed in some unknown cloud. It's not hydrogen. It's got a lot of hydroxyl and formaldehyde and stuff like that. And they had not, of course, they had not quite enough energy for another jump. So what do? And the solution is fairly straightforward and simple. I won't spoil that. The trickier part is the person who's supposed to come up with that on board the craft is someone who they call him a fusionist because he's in charge of the fusion. Apparently, operating this stuff is not so much something learned or trained, but something that some people just tend to be born with. You know, it's like you got to be like being a Mozart type musician. You can be trained in music, you can be trained in playing an instrument, but the ability to just compose great stuff, you know, like a Paul McCartney or a Wolfgang Mozart or somebody who just has music, or Tchaikovsky, you know, who just has music just pouring out of them all the time. You know, you can't teach a person that. You can only find some people who are born to do it. And it's the same thing apparently with being someone who can competently handle the fusion power of driving a spacecraft through these hyperspatial jumps from one place to another. And as it happens, the fusionists tend to be highly temperamental individuals. You have to treat them with kid gloves, and a much bigger part of the whole story is how do you give him an idea without telling him? Because he's going to be too proud to let anybody else tell him anything what to do beyond the bare parameters of what is expected. Get us from here to there. Okay, that's it. But don't tell me how to do it. I'm the genius here, not you. You know, you're all idiots, and I don't want you telling me what to do. But you could do my job. You know, I mean, it's just a terrible attitude. But apparently, it tends to come with having the kind of abilities it takes to actually do that. So that was the second part of the whole story. So you kind of have these two things to solve, and they both do kind of get solved. Again, I won't spoil how that happens. And okay, it's a fun little story, and by the time you get to the end, you understand why it says take a match. So the story is also collected in by Jupiter. In fact, it's one of the last few stories. So I haven't discerned any obvious differences other than that in by Jupiter. Instead of the little blurb, it actually has a small description of how this story came to be written. I'll just read this thing here. The next story was written as a result of a comedy of errors. In January of 1971, as a result of a complicated set of circumstances, I promised Bob Silverberg that I would write a short story for an anthology of originals he was preparing. This was the anthology. So, he's not going to explain the complicated circumstances here, but apparently they had something to do with he started a story, and instead of a short story, he wrote his next great entirely original novel since the 1950s, which, you know, I mean, the last one he had written was the Death Dealers or A Whiff of Death. And, or if you want a space novel before that, it would have to be The Naked Sun. Now, he had novelized the Fantastic Voyage movie, and he made it read as if it was his own, pretty much. But that really wasn't his story. It was pretty much the movie, and then he could do a few tweaks here and there to try to make it a little more scientific. The next real novel that he writes was The Gods Themselves. But that's handled in the story of The Gods Themselves. So, I wrote the short story. It turned out to be not a short story. To my surprise, I wrote a novel, The Gods Themselves, my first science fiction novel in 15 years, if you don't count Fantastic Voyage. It wasn't a bad novel, since it won a Hugo and the Nebula, and showed the science fiction world that the old man still had it. Nevertheless, it put me in the hole, since there was still a short story I promised Bob. So I wrote another, therefore, Take a Match, and it appeared in this anthology. So, there it all is, and that kind of gives us an idea of the story and where it came from and how it was. They asked, basically, it was asked for, and he promised it, so he had to do it. And there is the story of Take a Match. Thank you very much.